In the 1960s, Carlos Castaneda broke the boundaries of modern anthropology. He studied the magical rituals of Native Americans and claimed he became a shaman himself.
What he had done was just tremendous. Here was someone who was studying anthropology but also becoming a shaman and going in a direction that seemed really thrilling.
Hailed as the grandfather of the New Age, Castaneda inspired a generation to set off in search of spiritual enlightenment, drugs, and an alternative reality.
It changed his life, and it changed the life of thousands, if not millions, of people on this planet. Some of the finest minds today have actually come to me and told me they would be nothing without my father.
But while some thought Castaneda was an anthropological pioneer, others thought he abused his power.
His deception of people is seeking power. It's exerting power. He has the power to make them think whatever he likes.
This program unravels the mystery of the most controversial figure in the history of anthropology.
Carlos Castaneda's life was like an earthquake, and the closer you were to the epicenter, the more damage there was.
Death Valley, California. One of the hottest and driest places on Earth. Few creatures can survive here. Three years ago, two hikers stumbled across the remains of a human body. Detective Marston Mottweiler was called in to investigate.
We found the backbone, the pelvis, most of the long bones of the body, and we found a jawbone. We discovered clothing articles with the remains consistent with what a woman would wear, but there was nothing found with the body to give us a lead on identification, and we had no information at that time about who this person might have been.
For 3 years, the person's identity remained a mystery. But then Mottweiler uncovered new evidence.
Through our investigation of researching records and incidents that occurred in that area, we discovered that a park ranger from the Death Valley National Park had found an abandoned vehicle there in 1998. And the vehicle identification number led us to the registered owner, Patricia Parton.
Patricia Parton was Carlos Castaneda's adopted daughter and his lover. She had suddenly disappeared from her home in Los Angeles in 1998. How Parton's body had ended up in Death Valley was the final horrific twist in an extraordinary anthropological saga that had started over 40 years earlier. In 1960, Carlos Castaneda was a graduate student, studying for his PhD in anthropology at the University of California in Los Angeles.
I first met Carlos at UCLA, and he was just a very pleasant fellow to be around, and very rational and logical. But like many graduate students, he did not have a clear idea, I think, of where he was going, and just enjoyed the climate and the people at UCLA.
But in May 1960, Castaneda was sent out into the field to study Native American culture.
He had an assignment in anthropology, and the professor said he wanted something real, not something they read in a book and copied. He promised them all they'd get an A if they found a real Indian and interviewed him.
It was in Nogales, a small town on the Mexican border, that Castaneda was to meet the Native American man who would change his life forever. Don Juan Matus was a reclusive shaman from a Mexican tribe called the Yaqui. Castaneda had received a tip-off that Don Juan possessed great wisdom and would be the perfect person for his study. But it was not an easy encounter.
I don't think that when he first met him, he understood what the importance of the meeting was. And I'm sure that Don Juan didn't know what the importance of that meeting was either.
He seemed to have seen through me. As I rattled on, he nodded slowly and looked at me, but said nothing. Finally, after what seemed like a very long time, Don Juan got up. His bus had come. He said goodbye and left the station.
Castaneda describes that he made him very uncertain, and he got very upset in a way. He knew he had to see this person again. It was a defining moment because it changes his life.
By the 1960s, shamanism had been identified by anthropologists as a key feature of many tribal societies around the world. A cross between a doctor, medium and priest, the shaman was thought to be able to communicate with the spirit world in order to provide healing, guidance and wisdom.
Shamanism is predicated on the world of the spirits, and the spirits provide training, they provide information, they provide skills, they can be sort of like an advanced warning system. Spirits come and tell you that things are happening.
While the shaman was revered by tribal members, little was known by academics at the time about his practices. Anthropologists saw their rituals as having little real effect. But Castaneda intended to take shamanism seriously.
I made a point of finding out where Don Juan lived and visited him several times. When I arrived at his house, I felt moody and nervous. But I found his manner very reassuring.
It was then that Castaneda's journey into the hidden world of the Yaqui shaman began. Central to shamanism was a knowledge of the various plants used in its rituals.
Plants have a spirit. This is really the basic part of American Indian and Mexican Indian religion. The idea is that they're going to be able to teach us whatever it is we need to know.
Over the course of many meetings, Castaneda managed to convince Don Juan to teach him about peyote, a hallucinogenic cactus used by shamans in Mexico. Venerated in art and culture, the peyote plant was to contain a sacred ancestor spirit. Eating the plant would make the spirit appear, but it was unpredictable, at times friendly, at others terrifying. Castaneda had hoped just to observe and take notes, but Don Juan explained that to understand shamanism fully, he must take peyote himself.
It was a moment of acute indecision and fear. I felt almost unable to control myself. My hands were wet, and my stomach contracted.
I mean, here's Carlos. He wouldn't touch beer, for example. He wouldn't touch it then, and he wouldn't touch it later when I saw him later. And he's just not a fellow who seems to be interested in drugs or anything like that.
He was afraid those hallucinogens are not something that he had done prior in his life, so he was scared out of his mind.
Don Juan urged me to chew it. The conversation became very lively. The men were talking in Italian and repeated over and over one phrase about the stupidity of sharks. I thought it was a logical, coherent topic. Every memory came back to me at once, and suddenly all was clear in my mind. I raised my head and saw a black dog approaching. The dog became iridescent. An intense light radiated from its body.
Interpreting Castaneda's vision the next day, Don Juan explained that the dog he had seen was in fact the spirit of the peyote plant. The spirit had never appeared to a Western man in this way before. Don Juan saw it as an omen that Castaneda had been chosen to become his apprentice. Castaneda accepted the challenge, and in doing so, he took anthropological research to a whole new extreme.
Castaneda went native. He went and apprenticed himself to a religious practitioner and followed relatively exclusively the training under that single individual. Most anthropologists don't take that in-depth approach to studying one very narrow aspect of the culture.
Carlos Castaneda, in a sense, created an academic transgression by breaking the boundaries between the observer and the participant. In social science, you are not supposed to do that. You are supposed to simply observe, be a witness, write about something, and then leave.
Castaneda dedicated the next 4 years of his life to his apprenticeship with Don Juan, but his personal life suffered as a result.
He told me that he had met a man that was a sorcerer, Don Juan, and he said that he was going to spend a lot of time with him, and he left me when he came back, and he just wasn't the same that he had been before.
He sacrificed having a normal life with my mother, and he said it was the saddest day of his life. But my father had an unbending intent, and his intent was to, at the time, to get what he needed for his thesis, and then it evolved into much more.
First you get symptoms,
One of the shaman's greatest skills was divination, the ability to foretell the future and reveal secrets hidden in the past. The plant used for divination was jimson weed. Its seeds could be crushed and made into a potion. Like peyote, jimson weed was thought to contain a powerful spirit.
Jimson weed is a very powerful substance, very dangerous. It produces deaths every year in the United States. Like the hallucinogens, it can produce visionary experiences, but it can also have a lot of toxic effects on the body.
Castaneda claimed that in his trance, he saw that a close friend was on the verge of mental collapse. Another vision helped him to identify the person responsible for a series of crimes at his university.
After this vision, this person was caught at the UCLA library and sentenced to prison and made to pay an enormous fine for having done this.
In the course of his apprenticeship, Castaneda became more and more versed in the effects of the plants used in shamanic rituals.
The plants were basically designed to break down his defenses, break down his worldview, sort of stop his descriptions of reality in order to allow him to perceive the world in a different way.
Under the influence of hallucinogenic mushrooms, Castaneda even came to believe he could fly.
The momentum carried me forward, and from there I soared. I saw the dark mass of the mountains. My speed was extraordinary. I enjoyed such freedom and swiftness as I had never known before.
He said he turned into a crow one time. Did you read that? And I never see a crow fly over that I don't talk to it and call it Carlos.
"1965 marked a turning point for Castaneda. He began to see visions and spirits without the use of hallucinogens, and accepted Don Juan's explanation that these were glimpses of other realities that existed alongside our own. For the first time, he truly saw the world through Native American eyes. But the 4-year apprenticeship was beginning to take its toll. Castaneda became increasingly disorientated as the line between one reality and another became blurred. He began to fear he was losing his reason.
He's terrified. He's absolutely terrified. He's so devastated and so shaken by this that he knows that is the end of the 4 to 5 year apprenticeship that he describes in the teachings of Don Juan.
To save his sanity, Castaneda returned to California and set about writing up his thesis. At the time, he had no idea of its potential.
One time, he pulled out this dirty, rat-chewed manuscript and said, "Here, would you read this piece of shit?"
But then, Castaneda's thesis was picked up by the University of California Press and published in 1968.
I just was amazed. I never thought that Carlos would get that book published. And from then on, there was no limit to what happened.
timing of the book couldn't have been better. A generation in the midst of conflict tuned into Castaneda's idea that an alternative, better reality could be accessed by following Don Juan's teachings.
I think the reason why the book became so famous was because, spurred by the Vietnam War, a lot of people really embraced anti-establishment position and went after drugs to give them pleasure. And I think Carlos's book gave some scientific validation to their pleasure seeking.
Key to his contributions was the notion that our ordinary reality was not the real reality, but rather something that we had learned to perceive as members of our culture. And while this notion is customary in anthropology, he took it to an extreme, suggesting that there are totally different realities that can be experienced if one applies awareness and intention.
The teachings of Don Juan sold 16,000 copies a week, and Castaneda received the ultimate accolade, a place on the front cover of Time magazine.
Carlos was so popular. Once his books came out, he became the most popular guru in the country. Everybody wanted his writings. He became rich and famous. That made him a millionaire. His first book.
When his publishers pressed him for more books, Castaneda decided to return to Mexico to continue his research with Don Juan. 2 new books soon followed. Within anthropology, Castaneda's extreme method inspired a new generation of students, like J. Fikes.
He was a participant, so I thought, wow, that's the way that we should do things, is we should try to participate in the rituals if we want to learn something.
Fikes decided to follow in Castaneda's footsteps.
The next summer, I decided I would go to Mexico and try to find someone who could give me the sacred mushrooms that Castaneda wrote about. So I went down to Oaxaca and found an Indian village and found an old lady that sold me the mushrooms. And I had this feeling I was flying, just going right up into heaven. It was a great feeling. So I had these very extraordinary experiences that made me think that Castaneda must be right.
Fikes decided to study a similar Mexican tribe called the Huichol. They were well known for using the cactus peyote, and like Castaneda, a shaman decided to take him under his wing.
I impressed a Huichol shaman enough because he said, well, what did you see? What did you experience? And I told him. And he said, yeah, that's what this means. And so then he decided that he would help me. I proved myself, and then I was accepted. So again, that just affirmed that Castaneda must have been on the right track.
Then, at the height of his popularity, Castaneda made an announcement. His great spiritual mentor had died. But this was no ordinary death. Don Juan had turned into a shining column of light and journeyed to another reality called infinity. Castaneda now abandoned academic anthropology. He declared he had succeeded Don Juan as a shaman, charged with the task of passing on his knowledge to the world.
Carlos Castaneda becomes a being like Don Juan. He is a shaman, and the term that is specifically used in the books is the term Nagual, which means a being with enormous energy, a leader who can lead a group to freedom.
Basing himself in LA, Castaneda in his new role as spiritual guru, attracted a massive following. He offered the American audience a legal, drug-free route to the Enlightenment he had been taught by Don Juan.
In ancient Mexico, a lineage of men and women seers embarked on a navigational journey with the intent to expand the boundaries of human perception. These dreamt movements were taught to Carlos Castaneda by Don Juan Matus, a Yaqui Indian from Sonora, Mexico.
Central to his teachings was tensegrity, part martial art, part exercise class, part religious practice.
He was teaching maybe 700-800 people at a time, all in the room, all doing the same thing at the same time. It's basically like a very large exercise class.
The first time I saw Castaneda, this little Mexican-looking man comes in front of the class. And somebody took me by the arm and said, "Can I introduce you to Carlos Castaneda?" And I almost shit in my pants because this was Castaneda who was up front, who had been up front doing those movements all the time. And I thought it was just this little Mexican guy, this little brown guy.
Carlos Castaneda systematized and developed the magical passes into their modern form, tensegrity.
I thought he was just alive. He was spontaneous and charming.
And he was very funny.
He was a comic. He was an actor. He had terrific coordination and charismatic beyond expression.
I loved his idea of that there's more out there in the world than we can actually see. And Carlos promised that he would teach us and show us.
But not everyone was enchanted with Castaneda. In 1975, Richard DeMille, the son of filmmaker Cecil B., started to read the teachings of Don Juan. He would set in motion a controversial debate about the authenticity of Castaneda's fieldwork.
When I read the teachings of Don Juan, I thought it was a sober, factual account of a strange experience in the desert with a very unusual Indian teacher.
But as he read Castaneda's second and third books, DeMille was struck by inconsistencies in Don Juan's character.
In the first book, Don Juan's personality is dark and foreboding and gloomy, and there's a lot of menace in the air. But in the second and third book, he was lighthearted, gay, made jokes. It was fun, you know. He changed his teaching method by becoming a desert clown. But I thought, well, it's all right for Don Juan to change his teaching method.
But as he looked closer, DeMille spotted something. Book 1 and Book 3 covered exactly the same time period, and yet Don Juan's character was completely different in each account.
There is no way Don Juan's personality could change from day to day. The only explanation is that you have a writer playing around.
DeMille wrote to Castaneda asking to see his field notes.
He said there was a big flood in Westwood, or Santa Monica, or wherever, and the field notes were in the basement, and they were completely destroyed by the flood. What a loss to science.
Castaneda had always claimed that Don Juan was from a tribe called the Yaqui. But as DeMille checked anthropological sources, he discovered that unlike Don Juan, the Yaqui didn't use peyote in any of their religious rituals. The cactus didn't even grow in their territory. And there was something else. While checking through hundreds of sources, he discovered that Castaneda seemed to have copied other people's ideas. A book published in 1903 reported that the human aura was egg-shaped, with bristles standing out in all directions. In 1971, Don Juan told Castaneda that a man looks like an egg, with bristles bursting out in all directions. DeMille didn't just find one, but 200 such examples. For DeMille, there was only one logical conclusion.
His method of work seemed to be going into libraries and finding things in them that he liked, and in his following book, they would come out of Don Juan's mouth. Don Juan did not exist. He is a character in a story invented by Carlos Castaneda.
But despite DeMille's evidence, Castaneda's wife was not convinced.
He thought that Carlos made it up. And I know that he didn't. I know that he went on those trips and everything. And I know that, you know, that it's true.
For a start, Castaneda's family have some evidence that he did do fieldwork in Mexico.
This is a postcard from Sonora, Mexico, and it says, "I have been here in Mexico for a while now. Take care. Ciao. See."
Dearest Margarita, I was unable to write sooner because I just arrived from a 3-week field work in southern Mexico.
Castaneda's son even had first-hand experience of his father's research.
I would go with him on a lot of his field trips and spend a lot of time with him. We would take trips to Topanga Canyon into Mexico, and I would actually be, I guess, his little apprentice. I did remember meeting a Native American Indian in the desert. I was real little. I don't know that his name was Don Juan.
For DeMille's charge that there were no field notes,
there were boxes and boxes and boxes of field notes at his house in Westwood. Richard DeMille is absolutely wrong.
Castaneda's supporters even had an answer to the most damning criticism of all, that Don Juan could not be a Yaqui because the Yaqui didn't use peyote.
Don Juan had been exposed to many, many customs and traditions throughout Mexico because he had traveled extensively through Mexico. He was not a Yaqui who had never traveled outside of his territory nor traveled far from his group.
In fact, thousands of Yaqui people had been exiled at the turn of the century and forced to live in different parts of Mexico and Arizona. Castaneda had always maintained that Don Juan had been part of this diaspora.
I do think Don Juan Matos existed. I do not think the character is far-fetched, nor do I think he's an invention.
It was J. Fikes who would settle the debate once and for all. Down in Mexico, he had spent time with several shamans.
Finally, I understood what the shamans did to help their people. They were doing rituals to prevent illness, to bring rain, to get the corn to grow, to get the fish, to get deer, and to guarantee the things they need to survive as a people.
But according to Castaneda, Don Juan was doing none of these things. He was more concerned with personal enlightenment.
I just thought, well, it's a bit odd. It doesn't make sense given what I've observed. But maybe Don Juan is an exceptional person. And so I gave him the benefit of the doubt at that point.
Then Fikes received some new information that seemed to support Castaneda. He learned that in the late 1960s, Castaneda had been seen in a neighboring Huichol community with a shaman called Ramon Medina Silva. Fikes decided to investigate. Since Ramon Medina Silva was now dead, Fikes set about tracking down his widow.
There was this clue that I wanted to follow up on about the widow of this Huichol shaman. So I decided to locate her and interview her.
After years of controversy, it seemed at last there was an eyewitness that could finally corroborate Castaneda's story.
I found her living in a shack and tape-recorded interviews with her, and realized that she had met Castaneda.
Conocí a Castaneda, nos vimos en Tepi y lo conocieron a él también.
He definitely went to Mexico, there was no doubt in my mind.
Fikes began to wonder if in fact Ramon Medina Silva was actually Don Juan. There was a good reason why Castaneda might have changed his guru's name.
Well, one of the things that anthropologists have often had to do in order to protect the people that help them learn about the culture is to give their key informants some kind of anonymity, and sometimes disguising entire cultures, giving them fictitious names.
It occurred to me that maybe he was just protecting his informants. It's possible that Don Juan was actually the Huichol.
It seemed that Castaneda's critics had been wrong. He did in fact have first-hand experience of Native American culture.
Pues yo digo que no, porque no aguantó, no es como quiera, ¿verdad? No es como quiera.
But as the widow told Fikes more about the time Castaneda had spent with her husband, he began to realize the true value of Castaneda's research.
She was very willing to tell me everything that she knew about Castaneda.
Nunca preguntaba ni hizo entrevistas como nosotros.
Pues no, oía pues, pero no preguntaba de nada.
She said he didn't learn anything significant about the Huichol. That's the way she put it.
Above all, it became clear that Castaneda could never have been a shaman's apprentice. Huichol apprentices had to go on 5 annual pilgrimages where they made offerings to their ancestors before harvesting peyote. These pilgrimages required long periods of abstinence.
She told me that he was too interested in women to be able to go on a peyote hunt, because during that pilgrimage there's no sex, there's no bathing, there's no salt, there's fasting. And she told me he couldn't stand giving up all those things that a non-shaman values.
Now that he was certain that the Huichol were the model for Don Juan, Fikes realized the extent of Castaneda's deception.
He totally made stuff up when it came to the peyote rituals. There's no doubt in my mind it's all fabricated.
Seeing the peyote spirit, predicting the future, turning into a crow. These were all inventions, as was Castaneda's spiritual mentor, Don Juan.
I think Castaneda perpetrated the greatest hoax in anthropology since the Piltdown Man hoax. The Piltdown Man was not a true fossil. It was a concoction. And Castaneda did the same thing. He took bits and pieces of reality and fused them with fabricated things and put it out there as if it were true. And he's up there among the best con artists in history.
But did it really matter if Castaneda had fictionalized his fieldwork? When news of the hoax broke, some argued that his research still had value, even if the details were inaccurate.
To me, there are too many universal truths embodied in what Castaneda reveals. So whether or not every conversation was, a faithfully recorded conversation, I don't think is the point. I think the real question that we have to ask is, how does Castaneda expand our understanding of human nature, of reality?
But the idea that this was a victimless crime is simply not true. For a start, Castaneda's false depiction of the Yaqui way of life made him a millionaire, but left the Yaqui people themselves even more misunderstood.
Castaneda's works have been bothersome to Yaqui people because they still have people actually looking for Don Juan. And the first things out of their mouth is Castaneda's work and how familiar they are with the Yaqui way of life, which is not reflective at all in terms of how we are. There's a richer side to our life and how we live and what we believe that people don't give us credit for.
According to Fikes, Castaneda's work has been even more damaging for the Huichol. For them, hallucinogenic plants have deep cultural and religious significance, whereas Castaneda had popularized their use as the route to personal enlightenment and ecstasy. As a result, the Huichol were inundated with hippies on the hunt for peyote. The authorities soon became involved.
Follow me down.
Have you taken it?
Yeah.
What does it do for you?
It's a trip.
Fikes claims that as a result of the hippie invasion, the Mexican and American governments clamped down on the use of peyote.
It's a part of the cactus family. It's a hallucinogenic plant.
What will happen to these people now?
Well, we'll turn them over to the county authority.
Tell all the people that you see.
This clampdown didn't just affect the hippies. It struck at the heart of the Huichol culture.
Castaneda's work was having a negative impact on real American Indians and Mexican Indian people. Their people were being put into prison during the peyote pilgrimages because of these outsiders, these hippies that were interfering. And so Castaneda had done a lot of damage.
The charge is Castaneda had transgressed one of the most sacred rules in anthropology. He had caused terrible damage to the people he went to observe. But it did not end there. Castaneda's deception was about to have catastrophic consequences in his own culture. Living in LA during the 1980s and 90s, Castaneda increasingly withdrew from public life, never allowing himself to be photographed or interviewed. In his private classes, his claims became even more extreme. He now declared that, like Don Juan, he would not die a mortal death. Instead, he would turn into pure energy and disappear into infinity, taking his followers with him.
Well, he made all sorts of just totally incredible claims. He had claimed he was going to take a group of people with him off into infinity, and they were going to die and they weren't going to leave their bodies behind. And at the time, it seemed like it might be plausible.
You would be able to travel among galaxies and constellations and black holes and planets. And it wouldn't be your body anymore, it's your awareness that's able to take in all of this magnificence.
Greg and Gabby became increasingly concerned about some of Castaneda's teachings. In particular, his suggestion that his followers cut themselves off from friends and relatives.
It was a classic cult formation. These were people that had severed ties with their family and friends. They all changed their names. They changed their names like dirty underwear.
I dreaded the moment where Carlos would tell me to relinquish the relationship to my daughter, because I would never do it. You know, that was one thing I would never do.
Greg and Gabby decided to turn detective. Mounting a surveillance operation, they followed their guru's every move. Night after night, They trailed his car through the streets of Los Angeles, sometimes losing him, but picking up the search the next day. Castaneda had kept his address a secret, but by following him, they finally found his home.
Well, we're on the corner of Pandora and Eastbourne, and we parked in the spot. And this corner was good because we had the advantage point of seeing the gap in the hedge on Pandora, and also we were able to see their driveway on Eastbourne, so we were able to see any vehicle as it was arriving or leaving.
No one had ever filmed Castaneda before, but from their vantage point, Greg and Gabby finally succeeded. Now in his 70s, Castaneda claimed to live a solitary and celibate life, but it soon became clear this was far from the truth. Two of his closest disciples, Florinda Donner and Taisha Abelar, shared the house, and a third woman visited regularly. These women were always at Castaneda's side, and were known to his followers as the witches.
They all look like little boys. He had this thing about women looking like little boys.
Searching for more clues, Greg and Gabby took the drastic step of raiding Castaneda's trash. The reams of receipts they found showed that far from living the frugal life he claimed, he was showering the witches with expensive gifts and designer clothes. But a more shocking discovery was yet to come. An internet search came up with marriage certificates indicating that Castaneda had married two of the witches in the space of 1 week. Carlos Castaneda, their great spiritual guru, was a bigamist. Amy Wallace had first-hand experience of Castaneda's charms.
He said, it's very important that you do what the Nawal, I am the Nawal, I am the representative of that which is infinite, tells you to do. And Carlos, he wanted us to have sex in my childhood bedroom in order to break the spell of all the old energy.
One woman in particular held a special place in Castaneda's group. She was known as Nuri Alexander, or the Blue Scout.
The Blue Scout, she was the most important being on this planet besides Carlos. She was the one who would take us all to infinity. What she really was Patty Parton, a 19-year-old waitress he had made a pass at somewhere in Southern California, and had been completely brainwashed ever since.
The same Patty Parton, whose bones were discovered in Death Valley in 2003. Castaneda had taken the bizarre step of adopting Patty Parton as his daughter in the 1990s.
He was also sexually active with her, which made him adopting her as his daughter take on a whole strange atmosphere.
You know what he once said to me? You have the same vagina as my daughter. That's why I love it so much.
Shocked by what they had discovered about Castaneda, Greg and Gabby continued to raid his trash. Their next discovery would finally shatter all illusions about their guru's immortality.
We found insulin syringes in the trash, and it indicated that Carlos was diabetic.
We found this piece of paper that said hepatitis, renal dysfunction, ?
These are prescriptions for pain medication. Obviously he was in pain, and these just confirm that.
All these indications in the trash gave us a good overview of his physical condition, which was deteriorating very quickly at that point.
Greg and Gabby's surveillance footage showed an increasingly ill man. However, his family were denied access to him.
I walked up to those women, those weird, tall, big women that look like men. They're strange. And I said, do you know who I am? And they said, yes, we do. You're Margaret. And I said, I want to see Carlos. And they said, well, I'm sorry, but you can't see him. And I said, you bet he's going to see me. I'm going to stand here and I'm not leaving until I see him. And I talked to him. And finally, he came over to me, and I was so happy to see him. And I said, Carlos, I bought 2 books and I want you to sign them. And he said, oh, Miss Runyon, he said, my hands are too tired. He said, I can't write at all. He stood there and looked at me for a long time. And as he walked away, he threw me kisses and walked backwards. That's the last time I ever saw him.
The last time that I actually saw him alive, he had me write down my phone number and give it to him, and he put it in his shirt pocket. When the witches got in the van with him, I saw the driver of the van reach across into my dad's shirt pocket, pull it out, and wad it up and throw it out the window. That's the last time I ever saw my father alive.
When we went back the following weekend, the house was empty. We strongly suspected that he had died because the 5 women were gone. First, of course, we thought they might come back, but then, the weeks would go by and they would not return, which gave us the indication that they were really gone and Carlos was really dead, and then it came out in the papers.
Castaneda's death certificate revealed the immortal shaman had died of liver cancer, a very human disease. This revelation was too much for those closest to him to handle. The repercussions of years of deceit were about to become clear. Following Castaneda's death, 5 of the women closest to him disappeared from LA. It seemed that 4 of them had left town together, while Patty Partin had set off on her own.
I am firmly convinced that the other women committed suicide because after he died, they were like chickens with their heads cut off. Taisha Abelard got drunk and told me she was going to kill herself. Others talked about guns. I think the others shot themselves, and I think they did it in a place where no one could find them because they were very clever.
You have to remember, these were women who believed that Carlos was going to take them with him. And then they discovered that he couldn't even take himself. I'm sure it was a crushing blow. The reality that Carlos was an ordinary man. And they were ordinary people.
Patty Partin's remains were found in Death Valley 5 years after her disappearance.
I know how Patty Partin died because Carlos told me that he told her, if you want to go to infinity and you can't make it without me, drive your little car as fast as you can into the desert. The pull, as is written about in Carlos' books, will come and take her to him, and she will ascend. He was burned in the Culver City crematorium. 2 weeks later or so, Patty Parton drove her car into Death Valley. She probably got out and wandered around, and she probably passed out from the extraordinary heat or was attacked by an animal. And she died wanting to go to infinity to be with her lover and her father. Only bones were left.
The official cause of Parton's death and the whereabouts of the 4 other women remains a mystery.
In a way, I see Castaneda's story started in the desert, meeting Don Juan in the desert. And with Nuri, it ended in the desert.
The final horrific conclusion to Castaneda's fraudulent anthropological work was a fierce human tragedy.
Of the 6 women that were the very closest to the epicenter of Carlos, 5 are dead.
He's a very strange, private person who lives his whole life as a game with other people. Other people get hurt by the game because he doesn't deal with them honestly.
No one could have predicted that what started as a simple anthropology thesis could have such far-reaching and devastating consequences. Castaneda's anthropological fraud brought chaos to those who believed in him and damage to the culture he claimed to revere.
I think now I feel sad about it. When I was younger, I felt angry about it. I think I feel sad because there are so many centuries of misunderstanding between Europeans and native peoples, and Castaneda didn't do anything to make that better. He only made it worse.
The Food Critic and the Feast of Dog Meat, next on BBC4. Cooking in the Danger Zone heads to Korea.